Meredith stood frozen in her elegant living room, her hands trembling as she clutched the inheritance documents. The color drained from her face completely. Just 30 minutes ago, she had called her mother-in-law a burden. She had summoned strangers to take the old woman away to a nursing home. She had looked Dorothy straight in the eyes and told her she was worthless. Now, staring at those papers, Meredith realized she had just driven away a woman worth over $2 million and 3 valuable properties. This story begins 6 months earlier, when Dorothy first stepped into her son's home. Before we dive into this incredible journey, I want to know where you are watching from today. Drop your city and country in the comments below. And if stories about justice, family, and unexpected twists touch your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Trust me, you do not want to miss what happens when Dorothy reveals the truth that changes everything. Dorothy Mae Jenkins had lived alone in her modest house on West Charlotte for 3 years since her husband Harold passed away from heart failure. The house was small, painted pale blue with white shutters, and it sat on a quiet street where neighbors still waved at each other and children still played outside until the streetlights came on. Harold had bought that house back in 1982, when they were young and full of dreams, when the neighborhood was considered undesirable by most white families and property values were low enough for a black electrician and his nurse wife to afford. They had raised Raymond in that house, celebrated anniversaries, mourned losses, and built a life together brick by brick. Now Dorothy rattled around in those rooms alone, talking to Harold's photograph on the mantelpiece, keeping his reading glasses on the nightstand as if he might walk through the door any minute and need them. Harold Jenkins had been a master electrician for 40 years, working for the same company that initially refused to hire him because of the color of his skin. He had started as a helper, doing the jobs no one else wanted, crawling through tight spaces and working in the brutal summer heat of North Carolina. But Harold was smart, patient, and determined. He earned certifications. He saved every penny. And when opportunities arose to buy property during the real estate downturns of the 80s and 90s, he and Dorothy made quiet investments that no one in their family knew about. They lived modestly, drove used cars, and never flaunted anything. The wealth they accumulated sat in accounts and properties, growing silently while they continued to live as if they had nothing more than their pensions. Dorothy never told Raymond about the money. It was not that she did not trust her son, but rather that she and Harold had agreed long ago that their wealth should be a secret until they were gone. They wanted to see who Raymond would become without the expectation of inheritance. They wanted to know if he would work hard, build his own life, and treat his mother with respect because she deserved it, not because she had something to give him. Harold had seen too many families torn apart by money, too many children who became vultures circling their aging parents. He and Dorothy had promised each other that their son would never have the chance to become that kind of person. The fall happened on a Tuesday morning in late September. Dorothy had been reaching for a box of photographs on the top shelf of her closet, standing on a small step stool that she had used 1,000 times before. But this time, the stool shifted. Her foot slipped, and Dorothy fell backward onto the hardwood floor with a crack that she heard before she felt. The pain that followed was unlike anything she had experienced in her 68 years of living. She lay there for nearly 20 minutes before she could drag herself to the phone and call for help. The diagnosis at the hospital was a fractured hip that required immediate surgery and months of rehabilitation. The doctor, a kind white man named Franklin Moore who had been Dorothy's physician for 15 years, sat beside her bed and told her the truth she did not want to hear. Dr. Moore explained that Dorothy could not live alone during her recovery. The risk of another fall was too great. She would need assistance with bathing, dressing, cooking, and moving around her home. He recommended either a rehabilitation facility or moving in with family members who could provide daily care. Dorothy listened with her jaw set and her hands folded across her hospital gown. She had never depended on anyone since Harold died. She had prided herself on her independence, on being the woman who did not need help, who could handle everything on her own. But the pain in her hip and the fear in her heart told her that this time was different. This time, she could not do it alone. Raymond came to visit her in the hospital that evening, still wearing his work clothes from his job as a senior accountant at a real estate development firm in uptown Charlotte. He was 42 years old now, with graying temples and worried eyes that reminded Dorothy so much of Harold that it made her chest ache. Raymond had always been a good son, calling her every Sunday, visiting when he could, making sure she had what she needed. But Dorothy also knew that Raymond had changed since he married Meredith Whitmore 8 years ago. He was more careful now, more hesitant, as if he was always calculating the consequences of his words before he spoke them. The easy warmth that had once defined him had been replaced by a kind of cautious diplomacy that made Dorothy sad. Raymond sat in the plastic chair beside her bed and took her hand in his. He told her that he wanted her to come live with him and Meredith while she recovered. He said the house was big enough, that Jasmine would be thrilled to have her grandmother nearby, and that it was the right thing to do. Dorothy studied her son's face as he spoke, looking for any sign of hesitation or obligation. She saw only concern and love, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that everything would be fine. She told Raymond that she did not want to be a burden on his family. Raymond squeezed her hand and said that she could never be a burden, that she was his mother, and that family took care of family. Dorothy agreed to come, not knowing that her decision would set into motion events that would change all of their lives forever. Meredith received the news of her mother-in-law's impending arrival with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She stood in the kitchen of their 5-bedroom house in Ballantine, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Charlotte, stirring a pot of pasta while Raymond delivered the news. Meredith was 38 years old, blonde, and meticulously put together in a way that spoke of expensive salons and careful maintenance. She worked as a loan officer at one of the major banks downtown, a job she had held for 12 years and one that gave her a sense of importance she treasured. Her family, the Whitmores, had lived in Charlotte for generations, accumulating modest wealth and deep-seated prejudices that Meredith had inherited along with her blue eyes and her belief that certain people simply did not belong in certain places. When Raymond finished explaining the situation, Meredith set down her wooden spoon and turned to face him. Her voice was pleasant but her words were sharp. She asked Raymond how long this arrangement was expected to last. She pointed out that they had routines, schedules, and a way of life that worked because they had designed it carefully. She wondered aloud whether their home was really appropriate for an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery. She mentioned the stairs, the distance from the hospital, and the disruption to their daily lives. Raymond listened to each of her concerns with the patience of a man who had learned to weather his wife's objections like storms that eventually passed. He reminded her that Dorothy had raised him alone after his father's long work hours, that she had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities, and that he could not send her to some facility when she needed family. The argument that followed was conducted in hushed voices because Jasmine was upstairs doing homework and neither of them wanted their daughter to hear. Meredith complained that the house was not big enough, even though it had 5 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms. She worried about the cost of medical equipment, even though Raymond's salary and her income made them comfortable. She expressed concern about Dorothy's mental state, suggesting that older people often became confused and difficult after injuries, even though she had no evidence that Dorothy was anything but sharp. Finally, when she had run out of practical objections, Meredith fell back on the truth that she would never say aloud but that hovered between them like a ghost. She did not want Dorothy in her home because Dorothy was a reminder of everything Meredith had tried to leave behind when she married Raymond against her family's wishes. The Whitmore family had not attended Raymond and Meredith's wedding. Gerald Whitmore, Meredith's father, had made it clear that his daughter was making a mistake by marrying outside her race. Patricia Whitmore, Meredith's mother, had cried and begged and eventually gone silent, refusing to discuss the marriage at all. Meredith's brothers had sent awkward text messages but stayed away. The wedding had been small, held in a garden with only a handful of friends and Dorothy, who had worn a pale purple dress and smiled through her tears as her son promised to love a woman whose family could not accept him. Over the years, the Whitmores had softened slightly, showing up for holidays and birthdays, maintaining a cold politeness that never quite warmed. But the damage was done. Meredith lived with the constant awareness that she had disappointed her family, and sometimes, when she looked at Dorothy, she felt the weight of that disappointment pressing down on her chest. Raymond knew what his wife was thinking even though she never said it. He knew that Meredith carried shame about their marriage, shame that she had never fully processed or released. He knew that having Dorothy in the house would force Meredith to confront her choices every single day. But he also knew that he could not abandon his mother. The guilt of sending Dorothy to a facility, of choosing his wife's comfort over his mother's needs, would destroy something inside him that he could not afford to lose. So he stood firm in a way he rarely did with Meredith. He told her that this was not negotiable. He told her that Dorothy would come, and that they would make it work, and that he expected Meredith to be kind and welcoming. Meredith stared at her husband for a long moment, seeing something in his face that she had not seen in years. Then she nodded once, turned back to her pasta, and said that fine, Dorothy could come, but only temporarily, only until she was healed enough to return to her own home. The day Dorothy arrived at the house in Ballantine was gray and drizzling, the kind of autumn day that made Charlotte feel like a different city entirely. Raymond had rented a wheelchair-accessible van and had driven to the rehabilitation center where Dorothy had spent 4 weeks learning to walk again with a walker. She was thinner than before, her dark skin seeming to hang differently on her bones, her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. But her eyes were the same, bright and observant, taking in everything around her and filing it away for later consideration. She wore her best dress, a dark blue one with small white flowers that Harold had bought her for their 40th anniversary, because she wanted to make a good impression on her son's home even though she had visited it many times before. The house was impressive in a way that always made Dorothy slightly uncomfortable. It was made of pale brick and had tall white columns flanking the front door, a circular driveway with a fountain in the center, and landscaping so perfect it looked artificial. Inside, everything was decorated in shades of gray and white and cream, with occasional touches of silver that made the rooms feel like pages from a magazine rather than spaces where actual people lived. Dorothy had grown up in a house with mismatched furniture and family photographs covering every wall, and she had never quite understood the appeal of homes where everything matched and nothing personal was on display. Jasmine came running out of the house before the van had fully stopped. She was 16 years old, tall and slender, with her father's warm brown skin and her mother's angular features, a combination that made her strikingly beautiful in a way that drew attention wherever she went. But what Dorothy loved most about her granddaughter was her heart, which was open and generous and uncontaminated by the prejudices that plagued so many people in the world. Jasmine threw her arms around Dorothy right there in the driveway, not caring about the rain or the watching neighbors, telling her grandmother how happy she was that she was coming to live with them. Dorothy held her granddaughter tight and felt, for the first time since the fall, that maybe everything really would be okay. Meredith appeared in the doorway of the house, her smile perfectly arranged on her face like a piece of furniture. She welcomed Dorothy with words that sounded rehearsed, offered to help with her bags, and explained the arrangements that had been made. Dorothy would be staying in the guest room on the lower level, she said, the one that had been converted from a basement storage area. It had its own bathroom and was accessible without using the stairs, which would be better for Dorothy's recovery. Dorothy thanked her daughter-in-law graciously, but as she was wheeled through the house toward the elevator that would take her to the lower level, she could not help but notice that the guest room Meredith had described was the smallest and least desirable room in the entire house. The other guest rooms on the main floor were larger and brighter and closer to the kitchen, but apparently those were not suitable for Dorothy. The basement room, despite its fresh coat of paint and new bedding, still felt like what it was, a space that had been added as an afterthought, a place where unwanted things were stored. Dorothy settled into her small room without complaint. She unpacked her few belongings, arranged Harold's photograph on the nightstand, and placed the box of important documents that she had brought with her in the closet where no one would notice it. Raymond helped her get comfortable, showed her how to use the small television, and promised to check on her frequently. Jasmine brought her a vase of flowers and sat with her for an hour, talking about school and friends and all the things she wanted to show her grandmother. But Meredith did not come downstairs at all that first evening, and when Dorothy finally turned off her light to sleep, she lay in the darkness and listened to the sounds of the house above her, feeling more alone than she had felt in years. She knew that she was not truly welcome here. She could see it in Meredith's eyes, in the way she was positioned in the lowest room of the house, in the careful distance that her daughter-in-law maintained. But Dorothy had survived worse things than an unfriendly daughter-in-law. She would survive this too. The first few weeks in Raymond's house settled into a pattern that Dorothy quickly learned to navigate. She woke early each morning, before the rest of the household stirred, and spent time reading her Bible and praying for strength. The basement room was quiet at that hour, the only sounds the distant hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the house adjusting to the cold November air. Dorothy found comfort in these solitary moments, in the ritual of starting each day with faith and intention. By the time she heard movement upstairs, she was dressed and ready to face whatever the day might bring, her walker positioned beside her bed like a faithful companion. The rules began appearing almost immediately, delivered by Meredith in a voice that was always pleasant but somehow always felt like a reprimand. Dorothy was not to cook in the kitchen. Meredith explained that the spices Dorothy used were too strong, that they lingered in the air and the furniture, and that several of Meredith's colleagues who visited regularly had sensitive noses. Dorothy, who had cooked with the same spices her entire life, who had learned recipes from her grandmother that had been passed down through generations, accepted this restriction with a quiet nod. She began eating whatever meals Meredith prepared for the family, bland dishes of chicken and vegetables that tasted like nothing and filled her stomach without nourishing her soul. Occasionally, Jasmine would sneak down to the basement with hot sauce packets from a fast food restaurant, and Dorothy would add them to her plate in secret, savoring the small rebellion. Dorothy was also told that she should not invite friends to visit her at the house. Meredith framed this as concern for Dorothy's recovery, suggesting that too many visitors might tire her out or interfere with her rehabilitation exercises. But Dorothy understood the real reason. Meredith did not want Dorothy's friends, who were primarily black and from neighborhoods like West Charlotte, coming to her pristine house in Ballantine. She did not want her neighbors seeing unfamiliar faces, did not want to explain who these people were or why they were visiting. So Dorothy's best friend Beatrice, who had known her for over 40 years, who had held her hand at Harold's funeral and called her every single day since the fall, was reduced to phone conversations and the occasional video chat. Beatrice told Dorothy that she should stand up for herself, that she should demand the respect she deserved, but Dorothy was not ready for that confrontation. Not yet. Perhaps the most painful restriction was the one Meredith imposed regarding her parents' visits. Gerald and Patricia Whitmore came to the house approximately once a month, usually for Sunday dinner, and Meredith made it clear that Dorothy was not to be present during these occasions. The first time this happened, Meredith simply told Dorothy that she should rest that afternoon, that the dinner would be loud and tiring, and that she would bring Dorothy a plate afterward. Dorothy agreed, not fully understanding what was happening. But as she sat alone in her basement room, listening to the laughter and conversation drifting down from upstairs, she realized that she had been hidden away like something shameful, something that needed to be kept out of sight. The second time the Whitmores visited, Dorothy decided to come upstairs for a glass of water, curious to see how Meredith would react. She walked slowly with her walker, making her way to the kitchen, which was adjacent to the dining room where everyone was seated. She could see them through the open archway, Gerald at the head of the table with his silver hair and expensive sweater, Patricia beside him with her pearls and her pinched expression. Raymond sat across from them, looking uncomfortable, while Meredith performed the role of perfect hostess, refilling wine glasses and passing dishes. When Dorothy appeared in the doorway, the conversation stopped abruptly. Gerald looked up, his eyes narrowing, and asked Meredith in a voice that was clearly meant to be heard, "Who is that?" "Is that the help?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Dorothy stood frozen, her hands gripping her walker, her heart pounding against her ribs. She watched Meredith's face for some sign of correction, some indication that she would tell her father that this was actually her mother-in-law, the grandmother of his only grandchild. But Meredith said nothing. She simply turned to Dorothy with that same rehearsed smile and asked if she needed something from the kitchen. Dorothy said that she was just getting water and would return to her room. She filled a glass at the sink, her hands trembling slightly, and made her way back to the basement. Behind her, she heard the conversation resume, heard Gerald say something about not understanding why people kept household staff in the family areas, heard Patricia murmur agreement. No one corrected him, not Meredith, not even Raymond. That night, Dorothy cried for the first time since moving into the house. She sat on the edge of her bed with Harold's photograph in her hands, telling him what had happened, asking him what she should do. She had endured racism all her life, had faced it in hospitals where patients refused to let her touch them, in stores where clerks followed her down aisles, in 1,000 small daily humiliations that black people in America learned to absorb and keep moving. But this was different. This was her own family. This was her son sitting at that table and saying nothing while his wife's father called his mother the help. Jasmine became Dorothy's salvation during those difficult weeks. Every afternoon after school, the girl would appear in the basement room with her backpack and a smile, settling into the worn armchair that Dorothy had brought from her own home and staying for hours. They talked about everything, from Jasmine's classes and friends to deeper subjects like history, race, and what it meant to be a black woman in America. Jasmine had questions that her parents had never properly answered, questions about the civil rights movement and slavery and why some people still treated others differently because of skin color. Dorothy answered them all with patience and honesty, sharing stories from her own life that made the history textbooks come alive. Dorothy told Jasmine about her early years as a nurse in Charlotte, back when the hospitals were barely a decade past integration and many white patients still refused treatment from black staff. She described the supervisor who assigned her all the most difficult cases, hoping she would fail, and how she had succeeded instead through skill and determination. She explained how she had been paid less than white nurses with the same qualifications for years, how she had filed complaints that went nowhere, how she had eventually been promoted only after threatening to contact the NAACP. She talked about the apartment buildings that would not rent to her and Harold when they were newlyweds, the bank that denied their mortgage application 3 times before finally approving it, the constant low-grade pressure of living in a society that viewed her as less than. Jasmine listened to these stories with tears in her eyes and fire in her heart. She told her grandmother that it was not fair, that things should have changed by now, that she could not believe people still acted this way. Dorothy smiled sadly and said that change came slowly, that progress was measured in generations rather than years, and that Jasmine's job was to continue moving forward, to stand up against injustice whenever she saw it, to never accept being treated as less than. Jasmine asked her grandmother if she was angry at her mother for the way she acted. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment before answering. She said that anger was a heavy thing to carry, that it poisoned the person who held it more than the person it was directed at. She said that she tried to understand why Meredith behaved as she did, tried to see the fear and insecurity beneath the surface, even when it hurt. But she also said that understanding did not mean accepting, and that there would come a time when she would need to make a decision about how much more she was willing to endure. Raymond found himself caught in an impossible position between his mother and his wife, and he responded by trying to make himself invisible. He worked longer hours at the office, coming home after dinner most nights, avoiding the tension that filled his house like a fog. When he was home, he divided his time carefully, spending a few minutes with Dorothy in the basement before retreating upstairs to whatever Meredith required. He knew that his wife was treating his mother poorly. He could see it in the way Dorothy had been relegated to the worst room in the house, in the restrictions that had been placed on her life, in the absence of any warmth between the two women. But Raymond had learned long ago that confronting Meredith directly led to days of cold silence and pointed comments that made his life miserable. It was easier to avoid the conflict, to tell himself that things would improve with time, to wait for his mother to heal enough to return to her own home. Meredith began her campaign against Dorothy with small comments dropped into conversations with Raymond like poison into a well. She mentioned that Dorothy seemed confused sometimes, forgetting where she had put things or asking the same question twice. She suggested that Dorothy might be developing dementia, that perhaps the fall had affected her mind in ways they had not anticipated. She pointed to the basement room and said she had found lights left on, water running, the thermostat adjusted incorrectly. All of these were normal occurrences, the kind of minor forgetfulness that anyone might experience, but Meredith presented them as evidence of serious cognitive decline that required professional intervention. The whisper campaign extended beyond the house as well. Meredith began telling her neighbors about her difficult situation, about the confused elderly mother-in-law who required constant supervision, about the burden that had been placed on her family. She framed herself as a martyr, a devoted daughter-in-law sacrificing her own comfort for the sake of family obligation. The neighbors, most of whom had never spoken to Dorothy at all, nodded sympathetically and offered support. Some of them began looking at Dorothy with pity when they saw her in the yard, which Dorothy could not understand since she had never given them any reason for concern. She did not know that Meredith had painted her as a woman losing her mind, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Dorothy was not foolish. She understood exactly what Meredith was doing, even if she could not prove it. She had worked in healthcare for over 40 years and had seen families navigate the difficult terrain of aging parents many times. She recognized the pattern, the gradual building of a case, the preparation for an eventual placement in a facility. But Dorothy also knew that she held cards that Meredith could not see. The box of documents in her closet contained papers that would change everything if she chose to reveal them. She could end this charade at any time, could show Meredith and Raymond exactly what she was worth and watch their attitudes transform. But that was not what she wanted. Dorothy needed to know the truth about her son. She needed to see whether Raymond would stand up for her because she was his mother, not because she had money. So she waited and watched and gathered information, preparing for the moment when she would need to act. The brochures began appearing in mid-November, tucked into Meredith's purse where she thought no one would notice them. But Jasmine noticed. The girl had developed a habit of watching her mother carefully, tracking her movements and her moods, trying to understand this woman who had given birth to her but who sometimes seemed like a stranger. Jasmine found the brochures one afternoon while looking for her phone charger, which she thought her mother might have borrowed. They were glossy and colorful, featuring smiling elderly people in wheelchair and cheerful staff members in scrubs, advertising facilities with names like Sunset Pines and Golden Years Village and Peaceful Meadows. Jasmine felt her stomach drop as she flipped through them, recognizing what they meant. Her mother was planning to send her grandmother away. Sunset Pines Assisted Living Facility was located on the outskirts of Charlotte, in an area that had once been rural and was now a confused sprawl of strip malls and fast food restaurants. The facility itself was a large brick building that had been constructed in the 1970s and had not been significantly updated since. Online reviews painted a grim picture of understaffing, neglected residents, and cost-cutting measures that compromised care. Several former employees had posted anonymous warnings about conditions inside, describing rooms that smelled of urine, meal portions that barely met nutritional requirements, and management that prioritized profits over patient welfare. This was the place Meredith had selected for Dorothy, the cheapest option within 50 miles, a warehouse for inconvenient elderly people whose families wanted them out of sight and out of mind. Meredith researched the financial aspects carefully. Raymond would need to pay for Dorothy's care, since she apparently had no resources of her own. The cost at Sunset Pines was approximately $3,000 per month, a significant expense but one that Raymond could manage if they reduced some of their own spending. Meredith calculated that she could convince Raymond to agree if she presented the move as being in Dorothy's best interest, as a matter of proper medical care rather than convenience. She practiced her arguments in the mirror, rehearsing phrases like specialized attention and trained medical staff and what's best for her. She never said what she actually meant, which was that she wanted Dorothy gone, that she had never wanted her here in the first place, and that she would do whatever it took to reclaim her home and her life. The whisper campaign against Dorothy intensified as Meredith prepared the groundwork for her proposal. She began mentioning specific incidents to Raymond, embellishing and inventing as needed to build her case. She claimed that Dorothy had left the stove on after making tea, nearly causing a fire, even though Dorothy had not used the stove once since she was forbidden from cooking. She said that Dorothy had been wandering the house at night, confused about where she was, even though Dorothy had never left the basement after dark. She reported that Dorothy had become hostile and paranoid, accusing Meredith of things she had never done, even though Dorothy had never raised her voice or said an unkind word. Each lie was small enough to be plausible, but together they painted a picture of a woman in serious decline who required more care than any family could reasonably provide. Raymond listened to his wife's reports with growing concern. He had not noticed any of these behaviors himself, but he was rarely home and Meredith was the one who interacted with Dorothy most frequently. He trusted his wife, or at least he wanted to trust her, because the alternative was too uncomfortable to consider. If Meredith was exaggerating or lying, then Raymond would need to confront her, and confrontation was something he had spent his entire marriage avoiding. So he accepted her version of events, allowed himself to be convinced that his mother was declining, and began to wonder whether perhaps Meredith was right about the nursing home after all. Jasmine tried to intervene, to tell her father that her grandmother was fine, that she spent hours with her every day and had never seen any confusion or hostility. But Meredith dismissed her daughter's observations as the naivety of youth, suggesting that Jasmine was too close to the situation to see clearly. Besides, Meredith said, Dorothy was skilled at hiding her symptoms, putting on a good face for her granddaughter while revealing her true condition to the adults who were responsible for her care. Jasmine argued and cried and eventually fell silent, recognizing that her parents had already made up their minds and that nothing she said would change them. But she refused to stop visiting her grandmother, refused to abandon her to the loneliness of that basement room, and she began formulating her own plan to help if the worst came to pass. Dorothy received the phone call from Theodore Grant on a cold December afternoon when she was alone in her room, Jasmine not yet home from school and Meredith out shopping. Theodore was Harold's oldest friend, a man they had known since their early 20s when they all attended the same church in West Charlotte. He had gone on to become a successful attorney specializing in estate planning and had handled all of Harold's legal affairs for decades. His voice on the phone was warm and familiar, a reminder of better days when Harold was alive and their biggest worry was whether it would rain on their Saturday barbecue. Theodore explained that there were some documents that needed Dorothy's signature, paperwork related to one of the properties that was being refinanced for tax purposes. He asked if she could come to his office sometime in the next week, and Dorothy said she would find a way. But before the conversation ended, Theodore paused and asked how Dorothy was doing, really doing, because he had heard some things that concerned him. Dorothy was surprised, asking what he had heard. Theodore said that someone had called his office making inquiries about Dorothy's financial situation, asking whether she had any assets, whether there was any money beyond her pension. Theodore had of course revealed nothing, as attorney-client privilege extended even after Harold's death, but he was worried. Who would be making such inquiries, and why? Dorothy felt a chill pass through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She knew immediately who had made those calls. Meredith was investigating her, trying to determine whether Dorothy had anything worth taking before disposing of her in a nursing home. The thought was so calculated, so cold, that Dorothy struggled to process it. She had known that Meredith did not like her, had understood from the beginning that she was not welcome in this house. But this was something different. This was predatory. This was a woman treating her husband's mother like a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed, after first checking to make sure she was not worth keeping around. Dorothy knew then that she needed to see Theodore in person, needed to review her situation and make decisions about the future. She called a taxi service and arranged transportation for the following afternoon, when Meredith would be at work and Raymond would be occupied at his office. She did not tell anyone she was leaving. She simply dressed in her best clothes, gathered her identification and some papers from the box in her closet, and made her way out of the house through the basement door that opened onto the backyard. The taxi was waiting at the end of the driveway, and Dorothy felt like a prisoner making an escape as she climbed into the back seat and gave the driver Theodore's downtown address. Theodore's office was located on the 5th floor of an older building on Trade Street, in a neighborhood that had changed dramatically over the decades from a thriving black business district to a collection of parking lots and then to its current incarnation as an expensive urban center. Theodore himself had changed too, his hair now completely white and his tall frame slightly stooped with age, but his eyes were still sharp and his handshake was still firm. He welcomed Dorothy into his office, offered her tea and comfortable seating, and then got down to business. The documents Theodore spread across his desk told a story that would have shocked anyone who knew Dorothy only as the quiet elderly woman in Raymond Jenkins' basement. Harold Jenkins had died with assets totaling more than $2 million in cash, stocks, and bonds, distributed across accounts that he had carefully managed over 40 years of disciplined saving and smart investment. There were also 3 pieces of real estate: the house in West Charlotte where Dorothy had lived, another house in the same neighborhood that they had purchased in the 90s and converted to a rental property, and a small cabin in the mountains near Asheville that Harold had bought for a song during the recession of 2008. All of this now belonged to Dorothy. She was, by any reasonable standard, a wealthy woman. Theodore reviewed the current values with Dorothy, explaining that the properties had appreciated significantly and the investment accounts had grown even through the recent market volatility. He also discussed Harold's life insurance policy, which had been for $500,000 and had already been paid out into one of the accounts. The total estate, depending on market conditions, was worth somewhere between $2 and $2.5 million. Theodore asked Dorothy if she had given any thought to her own estate planning, to what would happen to these assets when she was gone. Dorothy said that she had been thinking about little else lately, but that she was not yet ready to make any changes to her will. First, she needed to see how things played out at her son's house. She needed to know who Raymond really was before she decided whether he would inherit anything at all. December brought Christmas decorations to the house in Ballantine, but the holiday cheer that normally filled the season was absent from Dorothy's experience. She watched from her basement room as Meredith transformed the upstairs into a winter wonderland, with a massive tree in the living room and wreaths on every door and twinkling lights that could be seen from the street. None of these decorations extended to the lower level. Dorothy's room remained as it had always been, plain and functional, a space designed for existence rather than celebration. She did not complain. She added her own touches, a small nativity scene she had brought from her house, a few Christmas cards from Beatrice and other friends, a photograph of her first Christmas with Harold when they were both young and the future seemed limitless. Jasmine's 17th birthday fell on December 23, 2 days before Christmas, a date that had always made her birthday celebrations feel like an afterthought overshadowed by the larger holiday. But this year, Meredith had decided to throw a proper party, a large gathering of family and friends that would take place in the main living areas of the house. She sent invitations, hired a caterer, and planned every detail with the precision of a military campaign. The party would serve multiple purposes. Celebrating Jasmine, of course, but also demonstrating to everyone in their social circle that the Jenkins family was prosperous, successful, and worthy of admiration. Meredith saw the event as an opportunity to cement her position in the Ballantine community, to prove that she belonged among these wealthy neighbors despite the complications of her marriage. Jasmine had one request for her birthday party, and she made it clear to both parents: she wanted her grandmother to be there. Not hiding in the basement. Not sequestered in her room where no one could see her. She wanted Dorothy sitting at the main table, participating in the celebration, acknowledged as the important family member she was. Jasmine presented this request over dinner one evening, her chin lifted in defiance, her eyes daring her mother to refuse. Raymond looked uncomfortable, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. Meredith's smile flickered for just a moment before she recovered her composure. Meredith's response was delivered in the reasonable tone she used when she wanted to seem agreeable while actually saying no. She explained that the party would be overwhelming for someone in Dorothy's condition, that the noise and the crowds would be exhausting, that it would be better for everyone if Dorothy rested comfortably downstairs. She offered to bring Dorothy a special plate of food, to have Jasmine spend time with her before or after the party, to make sure she did not feel excluded even though she would not be physically present. Jasmine rejected every compromise. She said that either her grandmother would be at the party or she would refuse to attend her own birthday celebration. She would go downstairs and sit with Dorothy instead, and Meredith could explain to all her fancy friends why the birthday girl was missing from her own party. The standoff lasted for 3 days. Meredith tried everything, from bribery to guilt to cold silence, but Jasmine would not budge. Finally, Raymond intervened, telling Meredith that perhaps it would be fine to have Dorothy upstairs for a little while, that they could set her up in a comfortable chair away from the main activity, that it would make Jasmine happy, and surely that was the point of the whole thing. Meredith agreed with visible reluctance, already planning how to minimize Dorothy's presence, how to position her in a corner where guests would not feel obligated to interact with her, how to make the old woman essentially invisible while technically fulfilling Jasmine's request. The day of the party arrived cold and gray, with a thin layer of frost covering the elaborate outdoor decorations. Dorothy dressed carefully in her best outfit, a deep burgundy dress she had bought for church years ago and worn only on special occasions. She styled her silver hair, applied a touch of makeup, and made her way upstairs with her walker, determined to celebrate her granddaughter's birthday regardless of how unwelcome she might be. Jasmine met her at the top of the stairs with a hug and a squeal of delight, telling her grandmother how beautiful she looked and how happy she was that she had come. For a moment, Dorothy felt like she belonged. The guests began arriving around noon, well-dressed couples from the neighborhood, colleagues of Raymond and Meredith, school friends of Jasmine with their parents in tow. The house filled with the sound of conversation and laughter, with the clink of glasses and the smell of catered food. Dorothy sat in the chair that had been designated for her, positioned in a corner of the living room where she could see everything but was not in the flow of traffic. She smiled at people who glanced her way, nodded politely when someone offered a brief greeting, and tried to ignore the fact that most guests seemed to be avoiding eye contact with her entirely. The Whitmores arrived 2 hours into the party, making an entrance that drew everyone's attention. Gerald Whitmore was dressed in an expensive suit despite the casual nature of the event, his silver hair slicked back and his bearing suggesting that he expected to be treated as the most important person in any room he entered. Patricia Whitmore wore a cream-colored ensemble that must have cost more than Dorothy's entire wardrobe, her jewelry catching the light with every movement. They greeted Meredith with the warmth that had been missing from their relationship for years, the family rift apparently healed now that enough time had passed and the grandchild they had initially rejected was nearly an adult. Gerald's eyes swept the room as he entered, taking in the decorations, the guests, the obvious display of wealth and success. His gaze passed over Dorothy without recognition, moved on, then returned. He turned to Meredith and asked the question that would echo in Dorothy's memory for years, "Who is that?" "The cleaning lady?" Meredith glanced in Dorothy's direction, and Dorothy watched her daughter-in-law's face for any sign of correction, any indication that she would tell her father the truth. But Meredith just smiled and said that they should go say hello to the birthday girl, steering her parents away from the corner where Dorothy sat. The moment stretched into an eternity as Dorothy processed what had happened. Gerald Whitmore had looked at her and seen nothing but her dark skin, had assumed based on that alone that she must be the help. And Meredith had not corrected him. Had not said, "Actually, father, that is my mother-in-law, Raymond's mother, the grandmother of your grandchild." Had simply accepted the insult and moved on as if Dorothy were not worth the breath it would take to acknowledge her. Raymond was somewhere in the house, and Dorothy wondered if he had heard, if he was aware of what his wife's father had said. She wondered if he would say anything, do anything, or if he would continue to be the silent, compliant son who let his mother be erased from his own family. Jasmine was the one who acted. She had been across the room when her grandfather arrived but had seen the exchange, had watched her mother steer him away without correcting his mistake. The girl's face flushed with anger as she crossed the room, her birthday dress swirling around her legs. She positioned herself next to her grandmother's chair and waited until she had the attention of the room. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, she made an announcement. She said that she wanted to introduce someone very special to everyone who did not already know her. "This is my grandmother, Dorothy Jenkins. She raised me as much as my parents did. She taught me what it means to be strong and kind and proud of who I am. And I am honored that she is here to celebrate my birthday with me." The room went silent. Gerald Whitmore's face flushed dark red as the implication of his mistake became clear. Patricia's hand flew to her pearl necklace as if seeking something to hold onto. Meredith looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. The other guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly aware that they had witnessed something significant, some family drama that they would discuss in whispered conversations for weeks to come. Raymond appeared from the kitchen, drawn by the sudden silence, his eyes moving from Jasmine to Dorothy to the Whitmores as he tried to understand what had happened. The fallout was immediate and ugly. Patricia turned and walked out of the house without a word, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. Gerald followed after shooting Meredith a look that promised a difficult conversation later. Meredith grabbed Jasmine's arm and pulled her into the kitchen, her voice a furious hiss as she demanded to know what the girl thought she was doing, embarrassing the family in front of everyone, ruining her own birthday party with this unnecessary drama. Jasmine pulled free and said that the only person who should be embarrassed was her mother, who had let her own father insult her husband's mother without saying a word. She said that she was ashamed to have a mother who cared more about what racist people thought than about doing the right thing. Raymond stood in the middle of the living room looking lost, unable to decide where to go or what to do. Dorothy caught his eye and saw something break inside her son, some final wall crumbling under the weight of everything that had happened. He walked over to her, knelt beside her chair, and said that he was sorry. He said he should have done something, should have said something, should have protected her. Dorothy took her son's face in her hands and told him that she loved him, but that love was not enough if he could not stand up for what was right. She said that she had lived her whole life fighting to be seen as a person, as someone who deserved respect and dignity, and she was too old and too tired to keep fighting this battle in her own family. That night, after the guests had gone and the caterers had cleaned up and the house was quiet, Dorothy sat on the edge of her bed in the basement room and called Beatrice. She told her friend everything that had happened, every humiliation and slight and betrayal since she had moved into this house. Beatrice listened without interruption, then told Dorothy that she needed to get out of there, that she had options, that she did not have to endure this abuse. Dorothy said she knew, but that she was not ready to leave yet. There was still something she needed to see, some final test that would tell her what she needed to know about her son. Beatrice asked what would be enough, what more evidence Dorothy needed that these people did not deserve her. Dorothy did not have an answer for that. She only knew that the end was coming soon, one way or another, and when it came, she would be ready. The days following the birthday party were marked by a cold silence that settled over the house like frost. Meredith barely spoke to Jasmine, communicating only in terse instructions and pointed looks. Raymond moved through his days like a ghost, present but not really there, his guilt manifesting as an inability to meet anyone's eyes for more than a moment. And Dorothy remained in her basement room more than ever, sensing that the aftermath of the party had shifted something fundamental in the family dynamics, that whatever happened next would determine whether she stayed or went. Meredith made her move 3 nights after the party, when Jasmine was asleep and Dorothy was settled in her basement room. She sat Raymond down in their bedroom and spoke for nearly an hour, her voice controlled and her arguments well rehearsed. She told him that things could not continue this way. She said that having Dorothy in the house was destroying their family, creating tension between mother and daughter, putting strain on their marriage, making everyone miserable. She presented herself as the victim, as someone who had tried her best to make an impossible situation work only to be attacked and humiliated by her own child at a public gathering. The nursing home, Meredith said, was the only solution. Not because they did not love Dorothy, but because they were simply not equipped to provide the level of care she required. A professional facility would have trained staff who could monitor her around the clock. It would have medical support available if she needed it. Most importantly, it would allow everyone to return to their normal lives, to rebuild the relationships that had been damaged by Dorothy's presence in the house. Meredith had already researched options, she said, had found a facility called Sunset Pines that was affordable and had openings. She showed Raymond the brochure with its smiling elderly residents and its promises of compassionate care. Raymond looked at the brochure for a long time without speaking. His thoughts were a jumble of guilt and obligation and the desperate desire for the conflict in his home to end. He loved his mother. He knew that what had happened at the party was wrong, that Meredith's parents had been offensive and his wife had failed to correct them. But he also loved his wife, or at least he loved the peace that came from keeping her happy, and Meredith was making it clear that peace would only return if Dorothy left. He asked about the cost, and Meredith explained that it would be manageable with some adjustments to their budget. He asked about the quality of care, and Meredith assured him that she had checked the ratings and that Sunset Pines was adequate. He did not ask to visit the facility himself. He did not search for the online reviews that would have revealed the truth about conditions there. He simply took his wife's word and agreed to consider the option. The words were barely out of his mouth before Meredith was moving forward. She suggested they schedule a tour of Sunset Pines for the following week. She offered to handle all the paperwork and arrangements so that Raymond would not be burdened. She painted a picture of how much better things would be once Dorothy was settled somewhere that could properly care for her, how they could visit regularly and feel good knowing she was in professional hands. Raymond agreed to everything, relieved to have someone else make the decisions, not wanting to examine too closely what he was consenting to. Dorothy overheard parts of this conversation through the ventilation system that connected the basement to the upper floors. The old house had quirks, including ductwork that carried sound from room to room if you knew where to listen. Dorothy had discovered this accidentally weeks ago and had used it occasionally to stay informed about what was happening above her. Now she sat perfectly still in the darkness of her room, straining to catch every word, her heart growing heavier with each phrase. She heard her son agree to send her away. She heard him accept Meredith's plan without fighting, without asking questions, without defending his mother. The betrayal was complete. But instead of despair, Dorothy felt something else rising in her chest, something that felt like clarity. The test was over. Raymond had failed. He had chosen his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity, chosen the path of least resistance over the path of righteousness. There was nothing more to see, no further evidence required. Dorothy knew now exactly what she needed to do, and she began making plans. Her first call was to Theodore Grant. She asked him to prepare new documents, a revised will that reflected her current wishes. Theodore asked what changes she wanted to make, and Dorothy told him. Everything would go to Jasmine, to be held in trust until she turned 25. Raymond would receive nothing. It was not punishment, Dorothy explained, it was education. Raymond had been given every advantage, had been raised with love and support and opportunity. If he could not stand up for his own mother, if he could not be a man in his own house, then perhaps losing his inheritance would teach him what she had failed to teach him in childhood. Theodore said he understood and would have the documents ready within a few days. Dorothy's second call was to Beatrice. She told her friend that she would be leaving the house soon, likely before the new year. She asked Beatrice to check on her house in West Charlotte, to make sure it was ready for her return. She also asked Beatrice to research home health agencies that could provide the assistance Dorothy still needed for her recovery. She would pay for the best care available. Money, it turned out, was not a problem. The week between Christmas and New Year passed in a strange suspended state. The family went through the motions of holiday celebration, exchanging gifts and eating meals together, but the underlying tensions made every interaction feel forced. Dorothy received a beautiful scarf from Jasmine and a generic gift card from Raymond and Meredith. She gave Jasmine a journal she had kept during her years as a nurse, filled with stories and observations and wisdom accumulated over decades. She gave Raymond a photograph of him with Harold, taken when Raymond was about 10 years old, both of them laughing at something the camera had not captured. She gave Meredith nothing at all. On December 30th, Dorothy went to Theodore's office one more time. She signed her new will in the presence of witnesses and had it notarized and filed properly. She also arranged for certain documents to be prepared, summaries of her assets that she could present if needed. Theodore asked her when she planned to reveal the truth, and Dorothy said she did not know yet. She was waiting for the right moment. She would recognize it when it came. She did not have to wait long. The morning of January 2nd began like any other since Dorothy had moved into the house. She woke early, said her prayers, and dressed in simple comfortable clothes for what she expected would be another quiet day in her basement room. Raymond had left for work early, his first day back after the holiday break, kissing Meredith goodbye at 7:30 and calling a quick farewell down the stairs to Dorothy. Jasmine was still asleep, enjoying the last days of winter vacation before school resumed. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of Meredith moving around upstairs, footsteps clicking on hardwood, cabinets opening and closing. Dorothy was eating a simple breakfast of toast and tea when she heard the doorbell ring. She paused, wondering who would be visiting so early in the morning. A few minutes later, she heard footsteps on the stairs, multiple pairs, more than just Meredith. Her door opened without a knock, and Meredith walked in followed by two people Dorothy had never seen before. A man in his 40s wearing khakis and a polo shirt with a logo embroidered on the chest. A woman about the same age in similar attire, carrying a clipboard and wearing a professional smile that did not reach her eyes. Meredith introduced them as staff members from Sunset Pines Assisted Living. She said they were here to help Dorothy transition to her new home, where she would receive the specialized care she needed. She said that Raymond had agreed that this was best, that the arrangements had been made, that Dorothy should pack her things and go with these nice people. She said all of this in a bright, cheerful voice, as if she were describing a pleasant surprise rather than an eviction. Dorothy set down her teacup carefully, buying herself time to think. She looked at the two strangers standing in her room, looked at Meredith with her satisfied smile, looked around at the small basement space that had been her prison for the past 4 months. Then she asked a single question. Does my son know you are doing this today, right now, without him here? Meredith's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. She said that Raymond had agreed to the nursing home and had left the timing to her discretion. She said that there was no point in prolonging the difficult goodbye, that it was better for everyone to just get it done. She said that Raymond would visit Dorothy at Sunset Pines soon, once she was settled. She said all the things that people say when they are trying to justify something they know is wrong. Dorothy stood up slowly, using her walker for support but keeping her spine straight and her eyes fixed on Meredith's face. She said that before she went anywhere, she needed to say something. She said that she had lived in this house for 4 months and had tried her best to be helpful, to be unobtrusive, to not cause any problems. She said that she had endured being hidden in the basement, being forbidden from cooking or having visitors, being presented as the help to Meredith's racist parents. She said that she had watched her own son fail to defend her again and again, had felt her heart break a little more each time. And through it all, she had said nothing, had kept her peace, had waited. But now, Dorothy said, she had something to tell Meredith. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a folded piece of paper that she had been carrying with her for days, waiting for this moment. She held it out to Meredith and told her to read it. Meredith looked confused but took the paper. She unfolded it and began to read, her eyes scanning the dense legal text. The document was a summary prepared by Theodore, listing Dorothy's assets in clear, straightforward terms. The bank accounts and their balances. The investment portfolio and its current value. The 3 properties and their estimated market prices. The total at the bottom, circled in red ink, $2.1 million. The transformation on Meredith's face was something Dorothy would remember for the rest of her life. The color drained away as the numbers registered. Her hands began to tremble. Her mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. She looked up at Dorothy, then back at the paper, then at Dorothy again, as if unable to reconcile the shabby old woman in front of her with the wealth described in the document. Finally she managed to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. This cannot be real. You have money? Dorothy took the paper back from Meredith's nerveless fingers and folded it carefully. She said yes, she had money. She and Harold had worked hard their entire lives, had saved and invested and built something substantial. They had never told anyone because they wanted to know who would treat them well when they appeared to have nothing. And now Dorothy knew. She knew exactly how Meredith had treated her when she thought Dorothy was just a poor old black woman with nothing to offer. She knew exactly what Meredith was. The 2 staff members from Sunset Pines stood frozen, clearly uncomfortable with the dramatic scene unfolding before them. The woman with the clipboard stepped forward hesitantly and asked if they should wait outside. Meredith did not answer, her eyes fixed on Dorothy with a mixture of horror and desperation. She was calculating, Dorothy could see, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation, how to undo the damage of the past 4 months, how to get her hands on the money that had suddenly appeared. Meredith began to cry. She said she was sorry, she had not known, she never would have. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence honestly. She would not have what? Would not have treated Dorothy like garbage? Would not have tried to ship her off to a substandard nursing home? Would not have hidden her from her racist parents? The apology, such as it was, only confirmed what Dorothy already knew. Meredith's regret was not about her behavior but about its consequences. She was not sorry for what she had done, she was sorry she had done it to someone who could make her pay. Dorothy told the staff from Sunset Pines that they could leave, that their services would not be needed. The woman with the clipboard looked at Meredith for confirmation, and when Meredith said nothing, she shrugged and headed for the door, the man following close behind. Dorothy could hear them climbing the stairs, could hear the front door open and close. Then it was just her and Meredith, standing in the basement room where Dorothy had spent so many lonely hours. Meredith tried again, her voice taking on a pleading tone that Dorothy had never heard from her before. She said that they were family, that they could start over, that she would do better. She promised to treat Dorothy with respect, to give her a proper room upstairs, to welcome her friends and let her cook and do everything she had been forbidden from doing. She said that she understood now, that she had been wrong, that she wanted a chance to make things right. The words tumbled out in a desperate stream, each one more hollow than the last. Dorothy listened until Meredith ran out of breath, then spoke quietly. She said that she had hoped her daughter-in-law was a better person. She had hoped that Raymond had married someone worthy of him, someone who would love his family as her own, someone whose character did not depend on financial calculations. She had been disappointed, and while she forgave Meredith, because forgiveness was something Dorothy had learned to give freely over a lifetime of receiving injustice, she would not forget. She would not pretend that the past 4 months had not happened. And she would certainly not stay in this house 1 minute longer. The sound of the front door bursting open made both women turn toward the stairs. Footsteps thundered down, and then Raymond appeared in the doorway, breathing hard, his tie loosened and his face wild with confusion and concern. Behind him came Jasmine, still in her pajamas, having been awakened by the commotion and having quickly texted her father when she realized what was happening. Raymond took in the scene, his mother standing with her walker, his wife with tear-stained cheeks, the strange tension in the air. He asked what was going on, demanded to know why there had been people from a nursing home at the house, asked if someone was going to explain to him why his daughter had sent him a frantic message saying that his mother was being taken away. Meredith started to speak, but Dorothy held up her hand for silence. She told Raymond to come closer, to sit down, to listen carefully because she was only going to say this once. Then, with Jasmine standing beside her for support, Dorothy told her son everything. She told him about Harold's investments and the properties and the money. She told him about the will she had made after Harold's death and the new will she had made just days ago. She told him about the phone calls to Theodore's office, about Meredith's investigation into Dorothy's finances, about the carefully orchestrated plan to ship her off to the cheapest nursing home in the county. As she spoke, Raymond's face went through a series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally a dawning horror as he understood not just what his wife had done but what he himself had allowed to happen. He turned to Meredith and asked if it was true. Meredith tried to defend herself, saying she had only been thinking of what was best for everyone, that she had not known about the money, that none of this would have happened if Dorothy had just been honest from the beginning. But even as she spoke, she seemed to realize how hollow her excuses sounded. She fell silent and stood with her arms wrapped around herself, looking smaller somehow, diminished. Raymond's voice cracked when he spoke again. He asked his mother why she had not told him about the money, why she had kept it secret all these years. Dorothy said that she had wanted to know who he really was. She had wanted to see whether he would stand up for her because she was his mother, because she deserved respect and love, or whether he would only value her if she had something to offer. And now she knew. He had failed the test. Not because he was a bad person, but because he was a weak one. He had allowed his wife to mistreat his mother because confrontation was uncomfortable, because keeping the peace was easier than doing what was right. Jasmine began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face as she listened to her grandmother speak. Raymond tried to respond, tried to explain or defend himself, but the words would not come. What could he say? Dorothy was right. He had stood by and watched while his mother was humiliated. He had agreed to send her to a nursing home without even visiting it first, without questioning why his wife was so eager to get rid of her. He had been a coward, and cowardice had a price. Dorothy announced her decision. She said that she would be leaving today, returning to her own home in West Charlotte where she belonged. She said that she had arranged for professional care to help with her recovery, that she did not need this family's assistance. And she said that she had changed her will. Everything she owned, every penny and every property, would go to Jasmine when she turned 25. Raymond would inherit nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. Raymond looked like someone had struck him, his face pale and his hands hanging limp at his sides. Meredith made a small choking sound, perhaps realizing that the fortune she had hoped to eventually access through her husband was now forever out of reach. Only Jasmine seemed unsurprised, she had already known, somehow, that her grandmother's love was not something that could be bought or sold, and that it would find its way to those who deserved it. Dorothy turned to Jasmine and took her granddaughter's hands. She said that the money was not a gift but a responsibility. She said that Jasmine would need to learn to manage it wisely, to use it for good, to never let it change who she was. She said that she would be there to teach her, to guide her, for as many years as God gave them together. But the most important inheritance she could give Jasmine was not money. It was the knowledge of who she was and where she came from, the strength to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult, the understanding that a person's worth had nothing to do with the color of their skin or the number in their bank account. Raymond finally found his voice. He fell to his knees in front of his mother and begged her forgiveness. He said he had been wrong, so wrong, that he was ashamed of how he had acted. He promised to do better, to be better, to become the man his father would have wanted him to be. Dorothy reached down and touched her son's face gently. She said that she forgave him, that she would always love him, but that forgiveness did not mean there were no consequences. He needed to learn to be strong, to stand on his own feet, to fight for what mattered. If losing his inheritance was the price of that lesson, then it was a price worth paying. The collapse of Meredith's world happened in stages over the following hours and days. Her parents called after Raymond phoned them with the news, and instead of sympathy, she received fury. Gerald Whitmore was apoplectic that his daughter had fumbled an opportunity to secure the family's financial future. He demanded to know how she could have been so stupid, how she could have driven away a woman worth millions with her small-minded prejudice. The irony of being lectured about prejudice by her racist father seemed lost on Meredith as she listened to his tirade. Patricia Whitmore simply cried and said nothing helpful at all. News spread through the Ballantine neighborhood with remarkable speed, as such news always does. Within days, everyone knew some version of the story. That Dorothy Jenkins was secretly wealthy, that Meredith had tried to dump her in a nursing home, that the inheritance had been redirected to the granddaughter. The neighbors who had nodded sympathetically when Meredith complained about her difficult mother-in-law now looked at her with contempt. The social standing she had worked so hard to build crumbled beneath her feet. The car that came to take Dorothy home to West Charlotte was not a taxi but a private luxury vehicle that Theodore had arranged. Dorothy had refused the car at first, saying it was too extravagant, but Theodore had insisted. He said she had spent 4 months being treated like she was not worth anything, and it was time she started living like the woman she actually was. So Dorothy allowed herself to be helped into the soft leather back seat, allowed herself to watch through the tinted windows as Ballantine faded away behind her, allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in a long time, free. Beatrice was waiting on the porch of Dorothy's pale blue house when the car pulled up, wrapped in a thick cardigan against the January chill. She had been there all morning, supervising the cleaning crew Dorothy had hired to get the house ready, making sure everything was perfect for her friend's return. When Dorothy emerged from the car, Beatrice hurried down the steps and pulled her into a fierce hug, holding on tight as if afraid Dorothy might disappear again if she let go. The house smelled of lemon cleaner and fresh flowers that Beatrice had placed in every room. Everything was just as Dorothy had left it 4 months ago, but also somehow different, as if the house itself was welcoming her back. Harold's photograph was still on the mantelpiece. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand. The kitchen still held the pots and pans they had used together, the spices Dorothy had been forbidden from using in Meredith's pristine home. Dorothy walked through each room slowly, reacquainting herself with her own life, feeling the tension of the past months begin to release from her shoulders. The rehabilitation continued over the following weeks, but now Dorothy was in control. She hired nurses from a top-rated home health agency, kind professional women who treated her with respect and helped her regain her strength. She attended physical therapy sessions at a clinic near her home, pushing herself to improve, determined to be fully independent again. The doctors were impressed by her progress, attributing it to her determination and her positive attitude. What they did not know was that Dorothy had something to live for now, something beyond mere survival. She had a granddaughter to guide and a fortune to manage and a life to enjoy for however many years remained. Jasmine began visiting every weekend without fail. She would arrive Friday after school and stay until Sunday evening, sleeping in the guest room that Dorothy had fixed up for her with new bedding and a desk for homework. They cooked together, old family recipes that Dorothy had learned from her grandmother and now passed down to her granddaughter. They talked for hours about everything from school gossip to philosophy to the complexities of race in America. They watched old movies and played cards and went for walks around the neighborhood when the weather permitted. The bond between them, already strong, grew deeper with each passing week. Dorothy began teaching Jasmine about money management, about investments and budgeting and the responsibility that came with wealth. She explained how she and Harold had built their nest egg over decades of disciplined saving, how they had resisted the temptation to spend on flashy things, how they had viewed their money as a tool for security rather than status. Jasmine listened carefully and asked smart questions, showing an aptitude for financial thinking that pleased Dorothy enormously. The girl would need these skills when the time came to manage her inheritance. One of the first things Dorothy did with her resources was establish the Harold Jenkins Memorial Scholarship Fund. The fund would provide financial assistance to Black students pursuing careers in healthcare, honoring Harold's memory while addressing the continuing underrepresentation of Black professionals in medical fields. Theodore helped set up the nonprofit structure and served on the board alongside Dorothy and Beatrice. Within the first year, they awarded scholarships to 15 students, young people whose lives would be transformed by the opportunity that Harold and Dorothy's careful planning had made possible. Raymond came to visit 6 weeks after Dorothy left, arriving alone in his sensible sedan with a grocery bag full of Dorothy's favorite foods. He looked different somehow, older and more tired, as if the past weeks had aged him years. He sat at Dorothy's kitchen table and told her what had happened since she left. He and Meredith had been fighting constantly. Their marriage, already strained by years of his passive acceptance and her controlling behavior, was now in full crisis. He was seeing a therapist for the first time in his life, trying to understand how he had become someone who would let his mother be treated so poorly. Dorothy listened without judgment, offering tea and cookies and the patient attention she had always given her son. When he finished, she told him that she was proud of him for seeking help, for trying to become better. She said that she did not expect him to divorce Meredith, that such decisions were his alone to make, but that she did expect him to become a man who stood up for what was right. If Meredith could change, truly change, then perhaps the marriage could be saved. But if not, Raymond would need to decide what kind of life he wanted to live. Raymond asked about the will, whether there was any chance Dorothy might reconsider. Dorothy said no, gently but firmly. The decision was final. But she also said that she still loved Raymond, that she wanted him in her life, that being disinherited did not mean being abandoned. He was her son. Nothing would change that. What mattered now was what he did going forward. The news about Meredith came in pieces over the following months. Raymond reported that her parents had cut off contact with her, blaming her entirely for the loss of the potential inheritance. Her brothers, who had never been close to her anyway, stopped returning her calls. At work, rumors about the nursing home incident had somehow spread, and Meredith found herself increasingly marginalized by colleagues who questioned her judgment and character. She was passed over for a promotion she had expected to receive, and shortly afterward, she was let go during a round of layoffs that seemed to target her specifically. A full year had passed since the day Meredith tried to send Dorothy to Sunset Pines. It was January again, cold and gray, but this time Dorothy sat in her warm living room with a cup of tea and a heart at peace. So much had changed in 12 months. Her hip had healed completely, the walker replaced by a cane that she rarely needed. The scholarship fund was thriving, with applications pouring in from across the state. Jasmine had been accepted to Duke University with a full academic scholarship, planning to study pre-med and eventually become a doctor like her grandmother had always dreamed of becoming, but had settled for nursing when medical school had been impossible for a Black woman of her generation. Raymond and Meredith had divorced after months of failed attempts at reconciliation. Meredith had demanded half of everything in the settlement, but since the assets were mostly in Raymond's name and the most valuable potential inheritance had been redirected to Jasmine, there was less to divide than she had hoped. She moved into a small apartment across town and took a job at a different bank, starting over from scratch at 39 years old with nothing but regrets and a damaged reputation. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the usual stack of bills and junk mail. Dorothy almost missed it among the circulars for grocery stores and credit card offers, but the handwriting on the envelope caught her attention. It was addressed to her in a shaky script that she did not recognize, with a return address that meant nothing to her. She opened it carefully and found inside a single page written on fine stationery, along with a business card for a nursing facility called Brookside Manor. The letter was from Patricia Whitmore. Dorothy read it twice before the contents fully registered. Gerald Whitmore had died of a stroke 3 months earlier, the letter explained. Patricia had been left alone in the large house in Myers Park with no one to care for her. Her health had been declining for years, kept at bay by expensive treatments and round-the-clock household help, but now the money was running out. Her sons had refused to take her in, citing busy lives and distant homes. Meredith, of course, could barely take care of herself, let alone her aging mother. Patricia needed to move to an assisted living facility, but she could not afford a decent one on her own. She was writing to Dorothy, she said, because she did not know where else to turn. There was no apology in the letter for the birthday party, no acknowledgement of the question that still rang in Dorothy's memory. Is that the cleaning lady? There was only the assumption, perhaps unconscious, that Dorothy would help because she had money and Patricia needed it. The letter was, in its own way, just as revealing as that question had been. Patricia still did not see Dorothy as a person deserving of respect. She saw her as a resource to be exploited. Dorothy sat with the letter for a long time, thinking about what to do. She called Beatrice and read it to her over the phone. Beatrice's opinion was immediate and forceful. Don't give that woman a dime. She said that Patricia had made her bed and should lie in it, that she had spent her whole life looking down on people like them and did not deserve their charity now. Dorothy listened and understood her friend's anger. She felt it herself, a hot flame of resentment for all the slights and insults she had endured from the Whitmore family. But Dorothy had also learned something in her 69 years of living, something that Beatrice's righteous anger could not overcome. She had learned that holding on to hatred was like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. She had learned that being the bigger person was not about being a doormat but about refusing to let other people's cruelty turn you into something you did not want to be. And she had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do in the face of injustice was to act with grace anyway. Dorothy wrote a check to Brookside Manor, enough to cover a year of care for Patricia Whitmore in a comfortable private room. She included a brief note saying that the payment was made in memory of Harold Jenkins, who had believed in treating everyone with dignity regardless of how they treated him. She did not include any contact information, did not invite any further communication, did not expect or want gratitude. The gift was not for Patricia. It was for Dorothy herself, a final release of the anger and hurt that she had carried for too long. When Jasmine came to visit that weekend and heard what her grandmother had done, she was confused. She asked why Dorothy would help someone who had treated her so badly, who had never apologized, who did not deserve kindness. Dorothy pulled her granddaughter close and tried to explain. She said that kindness was not about deserving. It was about who you chose to be in the world. She said that she had spent her whole life being judged by people who did not know her, being dismissed because of her skin color, being underestimated because of where she came from. If she let those people determine how she acted, then they had won. They had turned her into a mirror of their own smallness. But if she acted according to her own values, her own sense of right and wrong, then she stayed free. She stayed herself. Jasmine was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her grandmother's words. Then she asked if Dorothy had forgiven Patricia. Dorothy thought about the question carefully before answering. She said that forgiveness was complicated. She had let go of her anger, but she had not forgotten what had been done. She would not pretend that Patricia was a good person or that their relationship would ever be warm. What she had done was simply remove Patricia's power over her. By choosing to help anyway, Dorothy had proven that she was bigger than their hatred, stronger than their prejudice, more generous than they could ever understand. The story ends on a spring afternoon, months later, with Dorothy sitting on her front porch watching the neighborhood children play in the street. The azaleas are blooming in her front yard, pink and purple bursts of color that Harold had planted decades ago. Beatrice is beside her in the other rocking chair, and they are laughing about something one of them said, the easy laughter of old friends who have seen everything together. Jasmine is coming tomorrow, home from her first year at Duke with stories to tell and laundry to do. Raymond calls every Sunday now and visits twice a month, building slowly toward the relationship they should have had all along. The scholarship fund has grown beyond anything Dorothy imagined, and next month they will award their 50th scholarship to a young woman from rural North Carolina who dreams of becoming a nurse. Dorothy thinks about everything that has happened, all the pain and betrayal and eventual redemption. She thinks about Meredith, who called her a burden, and about the inheritance papers that changed everything. But mostly she thinks about what those months taught her. That your worth is never determined by how others treat you, that strength sometimes looks like silence and sometimes looks like speaking up, and that the best revenge is not revenge at all but simply living well and proving the haters wrong. The children are still playing as the sun begins to set, their voices carrying on the warm spring air. Dorothy closes her eyes and smiles, feeling Harold's presence beside her as clearly as she feels Beatrice's. She is home. She is at peace. And she knows, with absolute certainty, that the best chapters of her story are still being written. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you were Dorothy, would you have helped Patricia Whitmore after everything her family did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you think or feel or remember someone in your own life, please take a moment to hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories about justice, family, and the complicated beautiful mess of being human. And share this video with someone who needs to hear that their worth is not determined by how others treat them. Thank you for watching, for being here, for being part of this community. May you always know your own value, may you always stand up for what is right, and may you always find your way home. Until next time.